Welcome, everyone. If you just came in, please come to the front of the room and pick out our handouts and sign your name for the attendance sheet and help yourself to refreshments. My name is Jen Robb, and I'm our program manager in Student Affairs Office of Diversity and Inclusion, and I'm delighted by the turnout. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules for this very important topic. So I want you to know we're listening to you. Last year, students, faculty, and staff said they would enjoy this topic, and I'm so happy to be able to provide it. This forum is sponsored for our diversity committee. So diversity committee members in the room, if you could stand. Thank you. And I know Josh did a lot of marketing and coordination, so I appreciate that as well. He's our associate. So before we get started, I want to remind everyone that we have an initiative that's new this year, which is Diversity and Inclusion and Healthcare Certificate. That is to reward individuals who participate in 6 diversity and inclusion events. So this counts. That's why it's important to sign your name in the attendance sheet. Josh is kind enough to record participants who come to these, and in April, we'll be hosting a recognition ceremony at the New Jeans and recognizing everyone who completed the requirements for that certificate. And that's open to faculty, staff, and students. We'll be here the whole time. If you have additional questions, let us know. But in general, we send a follow-up email for first-time participants to attend an event outlining what they can do to get the certificate. So thank you very much. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Julia Applegate, who has prepared this entire presentation for us today.
Thank you. Thanks. I haven't done anything yet, so hopefully thank you guys for having me here today. I'm going to start by just introducing myself a little bit, and then we'll just dive right in. So I work at the Columbus City Health Department. How many of you are familiar with the City Health Department? That's really nice to see. We're down on Parsons, kind of that big, old, historic, Gothic-looking, kind of scary. They've only renovated the first 2 floors, so I don't know what happens on the 4 floors above us, but there's weird bats and stuff that fly around down there. Anyway, it's not scary, except in that respect. But so I'm with the City Health Department, and a couple of years ago, it hasn't even been 2 years yet, the health commissioner worked really hard to establish city funding, general funds, to look at health disparities in the LGBT community. So when she was able to push through a position that person who was initially scheduled to come here today, Dwayne Stewart, he's what is called your LGBTQ health advocate. So he's a person whose 100% job is to serve as an advocate for the LGBTQ population in Columbus around issues of health. I also work on the program. I lead that program. And over the course of the last year and a half, we've done a lot of work to try to get different ways that health disparities in this community. So that's why I was brought to talk with you today, is what are those health disparities that exist in the community, and what can we do to provide care. I come at this subject from a background in political science and women's studies. I got my master's in studies here at OSU, and I started working in healthcare through volunteering at an AIDS service organization, and just kind of found that public health was a really awesome place to converge social justice work with kind of feminist perspective I had on the world, and health in general. So if anyone's interested in public health, it's really in the field. But that's how I come to the subject. So typically when we do these things, we like to kind of start to just hear from the people in the room why you think talking about this subject matters to the work that you're doing. Either you're already practicing, or you will be practicing at some point, or even just kind of in your lives as you go through the world. Why does talking about this population matter to you? And it's having this because you let the committee know last year this was an important subject. But anyone want to share with me why talking about LGBTQ community matters? And if you don't think that it matters, or know why it matters, you could share that as well too. And maybe you'll feel differently by the end. Have any thoughts?
It's a large part of our community in Columbus.
Yeah.
So for healthcare practitioners, this community is kind of no.
So just thinking in general about the population of Columbus, there's a large LGBT population. Yeah.
then target the patients related to background history and their identity to make sure that they receive the best care.
Yeah, so in this instance, you have to do the work on the front end because you're not always know what you're serving. Yeah, what else?
I'm thinking about our students that, you're trained lab settings or clinical, the habits that they see us, the way that we interact with patients, and the habits they get as getting clinicians, they will carry careers. So I think it's important for me to make sure I kind of get it right as best as I can.
Yeah, and I mean, as the work that we've been doing the last year and a half, teaching this program, this subject matter to people who are just learning to become practitioners of whatever kind of health or social service is just, I'm so glad to be here talking to students because it is so important to get it on the front end. Anyone else have any other thoughts? Yeah.
This isn't a thought, but it's just a question.
Yes, most definitely. I'm going to get into all these
okay.
letters as we get going. So, but I'm glad you asked because a lot of people don't know that. There's a deliberate that's there. Anything else? Okay, and in general, please feel free to raise your hand at any time and stop me because I really appreciate more kind of interactive presentation than just me like talking. So our goals today are to discuss sexual orientation, gender identity, and issues of privilege related to both. We're going to describe specific health disparities experienced by the LGBTQ community, and we're going to discuss how to provide culturally competent care to that community. That's why we're here. So I'd like to start this presentation by looking at this image here. How many people have seen this before? A few of you. Okay. So if you're doing any work around sex and gender identity, sexual orientation, this is like kind of a new, has to be part of your Bible. You have to talk about this because this helps us understand what results in health disparities. This is part of why they happen. So the first thing I like to do when we talk about this community is try to make sure everyone's clear and understanding the difference between sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression. So this is a really good image to help us do that. So if you look at this genderbread person here, what it's trying to capture is, we'll start with biological sex first. So biological sex is simply whether someone is born male, female, or intersex, and it's everything to do with what's between your legs, okay? The anatomy between your legs, and then also those chromosomes in your body that help produce or not that anatomy, okay? So this image here is to remind you that when we're talking about sex, we're talking about only anatomy, chromosomes, biology. That's it. There's the other kind of sex, but in terms of gender identity and sexual orientation, we're talking about the biology, okay? So this genderbread person was kind of, I think it's been around like 6 or 8 years. There is an updated version that's more complicated than this. So the updated version one tries to disrupt the idea of binaries. This one does too, but it does it in a more explicit way in terms of the graphs and everything. But it also, I think, is a little bit confusing if you've never even seen the first one. So I just like to let you know that if you're sitting there thinking, oh my God, this makes everything into binaries and that's not good, there actually is an updated version one that takes it deeper. But if you're not used to seeing this and thinking this way, I think this is a good place to start. So in terms of biology, we're typically used to thinking of bodies as either male or female. And you guys in the medical field probably do know that people can be born with some combination of male and female chromosomes anatomy. The term that's often used to describe that is an intersex condition. That it replaces older language. Hermaphrodite is what was used in the past. That's considered offensive language right now. In a medical context, the language that's being used for an intersex condition, somewhere on that intersex spectrum, is DSD, which stands for Disorder of Sex Development. So if you happen to get into endocrinology, you might learn about DSD. And this language, intersex DSD, is One is a medicalized term, the intersex term to describe some sort of combination of male and female anatomy and chromosomes is more of a cultural term. And there's a lot of debate around which term is good or not. But anyway, so all of those terms there are talking only about biological sex. That's it. That's all it is. So when you're asked on your intake forms what your sex is, that answer really, the only thing it should be telling your clinician is what's going on in terms of chromosomes and your anatomy. Nothing else. So the next thing that people are typically used to thinking about and conflating is gender identity with biological sex. So gender identity is kind of what's going on up here in your brain. How do you feel about what's between your legs or isn't? The gender identity, it's all about just how it is, how you interpret how you feel about your sex identity. Okay. And the terms we use to describe gender identities are man, woman, and then again, all of this stuff we're looking at taking place across the spectrum. So gender queer is one kind of language that captures people who feel like they're not really identifying as either, or one in particular, that they're feeling like this is, for me, my gender identity, how I think of myself in terms of my expression of gender is somewhere along the spectrum between man or woman. Gender expression, that refers to everything on the outside of the body. So what clothes you have on, your stance, how do you stand, what colors you wear, how your hair is shaped, kind of shoes you're wearing, the tone of your voice. All of those things are expression of a person's gender. It's defined up here as how you demonstrate your gender based on traditional roles through the ways you dress, act, behave, and interact. So the terms that go along with gender expression are whether you're expressing in a masculine, feminine way, those are the poles, opposites, or in some sort of androgynous way, and that's kind of some combination of both male and female. So when you think about gender expression, I think one of the things that best illustrates how gender plays out in our society is to think about pregnancy, and when, in your life have you encountered someone who's having a baby, or if you yourself has been pregnant, what's one of those first questions that gets asked when you're pregnant? You're all smiling. What is it? Yeah, is it going to be a boy or a girl? And when people ask that question, are they asking because they want to know what kind of anatomy that little baby's going to have? What is it that they want to know?
Yes.
How they're going to express it? What the nursery's going to look like? What else?
What clothes?
What clothes? Yeah, like maybe they already start thinking, like parents, if one is pregnant, might start thinking, yes, I'm going to get a football player, and I'm going to have a granddaughter, I'll get the ballerina I've always wanted, right? So it goes way beyond anatomy and immediately puts into gender expression. So when we think about how gender, again, we're coming at this from a perspective that tries to look at the differences between these things, how gender gets constructed in society and socially produced. That's one of the places where it starts for human being out here in the world. That's right. Like as soon as and now you can find out that sex of a child earlier and earlier and earlier. So it's incredible how quickly people are making decisions about what's going to happen with the growing fetus in the body. Anyway, so when we're talking about gender expression, that's what we mean. Kind of everything that's going on the outside to really understand gender identity. Sexual orientation completely has nothing to do with any of the things that we've talked about so far. Sexual orientation is all about who you're attracted to. So that's the heart, kind of who you feel drawn to in your most intimate emotional connections. And those emotional connections get played out in terms of physical expression of that. But the sexual orientation is really all based on how one feels inside emotions. It doesn't have to do with a person's gender identity. In our culture, we tend to do a lot of conflating of gender identity with sexual orientation, i.e., you think about concerns of parents with their maybe 6-year-old boy who likes pink? Where do those concerns come from? What is the drive behind those concerns? And I'm talking typically not across the board, not everyone has these holds these cultural ideas, but if you think about that example in our society, what comes up for people? What do you think the concern is for parents who have, a more feminized little boy? What do you think? What do you think, parents? Anyone grow up a tomboy, or what's the flip side for boys?
If you're doing this framework to say that he is acting more like the less desirable, desirable.
Mm-hmm. And do you think there's a correlation then between his gender expression and a concern about his sexual orientation later in life? Yeah, lots of conflating of those things and expectations that if someone is biologically male, behaves in a feminine way, then therefore that person become gay in terms of their sexual orientation. So what this genderbread person tries to do is to kind of point out the differences between sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and to get us thinking about how these things are not predetermined, and one does not determine the other. Okay, so you're born female, that doesn't necessarily mean that you will express yourself, that you'll consider yourself a female, that you'll express yourself in a feminine way, and you will grow up to be a heterosexual. There's a lot of pressure in our culture to follow those tracks, but what the genderbread person tries to remind us the reality is that's not what happens. Any questions about this or comments? Okay. So the letters. The letters get at sexual orientation, gender identity, and then kind of just some cultural, broader kind of cultural expressions of both of those things in the community. So the L, the G, and the B, those are all sexual orientation letters. So the L is for lesbian, and that refers to a woman who is interested sexually and emotionally in another woman. That's all it is. Doesn't mean that it's a woman who likes to play softball. It doesn't mean it's a woman with short hair. It means a woman who likes to have sex and be emotionally connected to other women, period. It's a sexual orientation. The G is for gay, and that refers to men who are, in terms of their sexual orientation, drawn to other men. The G historically and still oftentimes is used more expansively to include women as well. But I think when you look at what has happened historically, that women have sometimes been erased from the gay community by the use of that term gay, that internationally and in most academic environments, you're going to see these letters ordered in this way. It's on purpose to really pull out the difference between males and females and putting the L first because of the historical kind of erasure of women. But gay refers to men who have sex with other men. B is bisexual, also a sexual orientation. Bi means two. That means that a bisexual person is drawn to people of both sexes. Okay? So those are all sexual orientations. The more medicalized language is homosexuality, heterosexuality, and bisexuality. So homosex means attracted to someone of the same sex. Heterosexual means attracted to someone of the opposite sex. Bisexual means attracted to both. Now, in terms of like street language, are people who are lesbian or gay identified using that more medicalized language, calling themselves homosexual? You're not going to hear that usually. Those are terms that were coined in the late 1800s to diagnose people who were in same-sex relationships and diagnose them in as a disorder. So that's language that most people are not going to, you're never going to see an H in these letters. Not to stand for homosexual, at least. I don't know. You never know. We're always adding letters, so it could stand for something else in the future, but not for homosexual. Heterosexual, that has less of a negative connotation because heterosexuality is the accepted sexual orientation in the world. But you're not going to hear, most heterosexuals aren't going to talk about being heterosexual. You have to talk about their sexual orientation that much. So, but again, it's the more kind of clinical language. And then bisexuality is actually for people who are bisexual identified, they feel okay with the B. The other letter, the T, that refers to gender identity. Okay, so again, we talked about the difference between sexual orientation and gender identity. For a transgender person, what you know about that person if someone identifies as transgender is that the gender expression that they have doesn't correlate with their anatomy that they would be assigned by the culture that we live in. So if I identified as a transgender person and I was identifying as a transgender male, you would be able to pretty safely conclude that I was born female, but felt that a gender expression for me that I was most comfortable with was more masculine oriented, that I kind of identified more as a male than as a female, even though my anatomy that I was born with was most likely female. Okay, so a transgender identity has everything to do with gender identity and not to do with sexual orientation.
Sorry, but I think I need to.
Okay. Okay, so let me just keep going through here. So the T stands for transgender, sometimes transsexual. Transsexual is similar to homosexual in that it's a more medicalized term. You'll hear that used less frequently now than you did in the past. A trans person who's trans identified is born anatomically as male or female, right? Typically on one end of the spectrum or the other. But how they feel about themselves in terms of their gender identity or gender expression doesn't correspond with traditional notions of what their anatomy should be, right? So if someone who's born with a vagina identifies or feels more masculine and more kind of drawn into traditional male behaviors, and then says, it's not just that I like to kick balls and climb trees, but I actually feel more male. There's something about me that doesn't feel like a female is the identity that fits for me. That person will identify as a male, will choose to identify not as a female, but as a male, even though anatomically or in terms of chromosomes, they would be identified as. Does that make sense? Right, and so what we see happening is a whole wide range of spectrums. So some people who are born one sex and identify as transgender will make changes to their anatomy. Okay, and that's transsexual term used to refer to someone who's actually made those physical changes. We're seeing that word used less frequently, but for people who aren't have had the opportunity to get educated about the intricacies of the T, it's good to know, to let people know what the difference is between transsexual. Some people will have no surgeries at all. Like surgery doesn't feel like something they need to change. They don't need to change their body in order to feel that they adopted a gender identity that's different than what they would be expected to adopt. So you'll find transgender people who have born male, identifies as female, and has had a complete sex reassignment surgery. Everything anatomically has been changed. They're taking hormones, they're living as a woman, they're expressing in very feminine ways, and in every way they've completely they've changed their anatomy, changed their gender expression, changed their gender. You will also find transgender people who were born maybe born female and who feel more masculine and male identified but don't make any anatomical changes whatsoever. Sometimes they don't change their name even, but they're just expressing in a more masculine way and they feel like they identify as a male. So your patient intake forms, when you're asking someone's sex, you also want to ask their gender because you want to know how they feel about, in order to give them the best care, you want to know how they feel about their gender identity. Because their experience of life is going to be a lot different if they've got a different gender expression, what they were assigned. Does that make sense? So, like, for example, I am a lesbian, so that's my sexual orientation. I was born female, that's my sex identity. My gender expression is definitely more on the masculine side, I would say. I mean, I usually say this is as feminine as it gets. I have this shirt that just sort of flips out a little bit, and that's as feminine as you're going to see. And my pants are men's pants. I prefer the cut of a men's pant, but I don't identify as a male. I would kind of feel like I've always felt like I identify more as just grown-up tomboy. And that's an identity that feels comfortable for me. And that's part of why this is so complicated. What we have on that genderbread person is just male, female, and genderqueer. But in terms of how people actually who fall in different spots along that spectrum identify, you might find themselves calling themselves genderqueer, two-spirit, boy, spelled B-O-I. What else? Who else knows some of these terms that you might think of any? Totally drawing back. There's so many. If you look on Facebook and the choices for gender identity, you will see, I don't know how many, probably 40 or 50 different identities. Lots of depending on what culture you live in. Two-spirit is a Native American language to capture people who are possess a little bit of masculine and feminine energy. So depending on where you live in the world, those terms are different. But in any case, so that's. I hope that helps you understand a little bit about the difference between sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, sexual expression, letters. That's the first four. The Q gets at the whole notion of all of this stuff being very fluid. Okay, and if you pay attention to this community, you will know that these letters have changed over time. Mostly what we do is we add letters. At Ohio State, I think you guys are typically using LGBTQIAA. You'll see increasingly LGBTQIAP. So let me explain. So I already went through LGBT. The Q stands for either queer or questioning. So queer gets at the notion of a feeling among many people who are more diverse in terms of their sexual orientation or gender identity expression, kind of wanting to reclaim a term that was used as a pejorative. So in the early 1990s, the queer theory movement happened, and kind of lots of academics reflected about, let's reclaim that term. That's a term that's used to denigrate. Typically, it was talking about sexual orientation, but gender identity as well. Hated those things so much. So at that time, there was a really a lot of academic conversation on this and kind of activist conversation around reclaiming that word. That was 20 years ago. Now in the mid whatever we are teens of this century, a lot of younger people just feel like queer is a broader term. Doesn't mean they have to tell someone right out their sexual orientation is different or their gender orientation is different. They don't have to attach them to the other. It allows them to just kind of say, I'm not your average typical person in terms of sexual orientation or gender identity or gender expression. I'm not following that straight line between born female or born with female anatomy, identifying as female, expressing as feminine, sexual. Queer allows, it's true that a lot of younger folks feel comfortable with it, allows them the space to say, I'm somewhere on these spectrums. Maybe at 19, I'm over here. Maybe at 22, I'll be over there. Maybe today, I'm here. Next week, depending on who I become attracted to, I'm going to be over here. But it allows for a fluidity that the poles don't allow for. Does that make sense? So whether you use that term queer or not, oftentimes when I talk about this, older people say, oh my God, I could never call it queer. I could never even say that word because it has such a pejorative connotation. You think of, I don't know if the people who are in their 20s grew up playing Smear the Queer, people in their 40s and 50s and 60s did, and it was just it was a horrible playground game, and I just had negative connotations. So it's a word to be aware of and to use with caution. And if someone identifies to you as queer, know that they feel comfortable with that, and they're okay with it. The other Q, so again, with these letters, a lot of times you'll see LGBTQQ, but two Qs to separate that out. That Q denotes questioning, and that's to draw attention to, again, the fact that people, they're all over the map, right? Not everyone, but there is a certain segment of the population that's going to be kind of unsure about where they fit on these poles at different points in life. And that allows people who kind of aren't sure, I'm not really sure where I fit right now in terms of my sexual orientation, but I feel I'm questioning it, and it gives me an opportunity to connect with this. The I stands for intersex. The A will stand for either asexual or ally. Asexual is people who aren't interested in sex at all. Allies are folks who are clued into this community and the diversity around it and comfortable with it. And then the P is what you'll see for pansexual. And that is to get at to any of you guys study anthropology. Pan is God, crazy God. The pansexual is just someone who anything goes, right? Like pansexuals are not, they're not asking questions about your sexual orientation or your gender identity. It's just like, I'm really drawn to you, whatever you are, and that's kind of, that explains my interest. I'm not going to pin myself down. So at the health department, we chose to call ourselves the LGBTQ Health Initiative because we wanted for sure the Q on there so that people would recognize that we were aware of the changing dynamics around that term, and that especially for younger people that we know that that's a safe word for you. We did not choose to add the I or any of the other letters. Services, intersexual. We also, it's an initiative to serve the LGBTQ allies. So in any case, that explains our letters. And then the last gender identity to talk about is the cisgender identity. That's a term that's been coined in the last 6 or 8 years as well. And that was kind of started to be used by academics to capture the notion that everybody has a gender identity. So the same way that we're all born with a sex identity, and we get asked that question all the time, everybody has a gender identity as well. If you, in terms of those poles, are kind of lining up on the extremes where you're born with a male anatomy, identify as male and you express in a masculine way, then your identity is a cisgender. And if you, same for the female, born female, express in a feminine way, identify as a woman, you're considered cisgender. That makes sense? So the point there was to call attention to the fact that everybody has a gender identity. We can tend to, when we're talking about identifying, forget that the more normative identity is also the same way, in terms of race. Like wanting to remind people that if you're white, you also have a race. You think about racial things as well, not just minority race. Okay, so before I talk about each of these terms, I just want to show you this video. This video comes from a TED Talk. You guys familiar with TED Talks? So there's a local TED Talk series here. It's called TEDx Columbus. And there's a filmmaker who's making a movie about the drag king and drag queen community. Anyway, she did this TED Talk about gender identity and the fluidity around it. And it's about 20 minutes long. You can find it on YouTube. But this is a very short clip of her talk that I think illustrates what I've been trying to explain to you really well. So it's very short, so pay attention, but it will hopefully help you see a little bit of what I've been trying to explain to you.
So let's imagine these three things as parallel. They do not intersect. You intersect anywhere on those three lines. And I have to grab my form because this part's a little complicated. You can be a super masculine, totally attracted only to women, dude, a long curly haired, lipstick wearing, lesbian, female, say. A metrosexual, heterosexual, male. A not super girly, not at all masculine, bisexual, woman. A feminine, heterosexual, trans man. A butch, gay man. A sometimes suit wearing, sometimes dress wearing, lesbian, trans woman. A cultured and sensitive gay man. Because that guy was European. The point is, the possibilities are endless. Now, this is also been further developed by Sam Kellerman with a gender right person.
No, she's talking about gender right person. So you understand why this is so complicated? I really love how she makes that visual there, and that is what happens when you're trying to think about how to provide culturally competent care. Is you need to allow your mind to expand to make a place for all of these possibilities and understand that all of these things are some combination of a person's sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression. Okay, so when looking at the kind of social or cultural norms that underpin this whole concept, there's a handout there that explains a couple of these terms, and these are some pretty academic terms. So when you're out, when I'm doing this training with social service providers and practitioners, I like to talk about these, get this idea in people's minds, but I don't have the expectation that anyone's going to come into a waiting room and really be able to talk in depth about heteronormativity or homophobia. But it's to introduce some of the ideas that later, or concepts, cultural norms that contribute to the health disparities that this community faces. So heteronormativity is the body of lifestyle norms that hold that people fall into distinct and complementary sexes, so those poles, male and female, with natural roles in life. So not just that you're male and female, but there's something about the roles that you should then, the path that you should walk in life that is prescribed to you and set in nature. It presumes that heterosexuality is the normal sexual orientation and states that sexual and marital relations are most or only fitting between a man or a woman, okay, and which leads to a heteronormative view that involves alignment of biological sex, sexuality, gender identity, and gender roles. So a heteronormative view of the world doesn't allow space for people that live like this, like what Gabrielle Burton was talking about here. It's very, the assumption being, as I've talked about, that you're all on those opposite ends of the poles. All of those things are foregone conclusions. Any deviation outside of that is wrong and should be fixed and is not a normal way to be in the world, okay? And then cisnormativity, I don't have the definition for it down here, but it's a similar concept around gender identity. But if a person identifies as female, then there's only certain ways that person should express themselves in very feminine ways, like long fingernails for women, long hair, high voice, feminine, more feminized career choices, those kind of things. So a cisnormative way of looking at the world is the expectation of a person's gender identity and gender expression should follow a path. Yeah, you have a question? Yes.
So this question, you would lay out for another culture.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, so in particular to the culture we're talking about. Cis means it's Latin for on the same side of. So trans is like trans crossing. Cis means you're staying on that same line. Okay, so heterosexism is a system of attitudes, bias, and discrimination in favor of opposite sex sexuality and relationships. It can include the presumption that other people are heterosexual or that opposite sex attractions and relationships are the only norm, and this is important, and therefore superior. So it's not just that it's the normal way to be, but it's also a better way to be. And this is where you run into problems culturally. It would be difficult enough if all you had to do was face that as the dominant in terms of statistics, right? Like the vast majority of the population is heterosexual. That makes it hard for smaller populations to feel comfortable. When you add that power dynamic in that sense that if you're not in that group, then you're somehow less than, that's where you get these power problems. And that's what this next thing talks about. It talks about the discrimination and how heterosexism ranks gays, lesbians, bisexuals, and other sexual minorities as second-class citizens with regard to various legal and civil rights, economic opportunities, and social equality jurisdictions and societies. And so we're in a point in time where we're seeing heterosexism kind of play out in the news on a daily basis. Just follow the marriage equality issues as it kind of unfolds state by state by state, right? That's an example of a heterosexist. The resistance to same-sex marriage is an example of a heterosexual or heterosexist norm playing out in terms of policy, government, civil society. So the fact that same-sex couples in Ohio are not allowed to be legally wed to each other, that is a heterosexist approach to the institution of marriage. Make sense? Okay. And we're seeing some of that heterosexism get dismantled, but it's not done yet. So homophobia is that fear or negative feelings associated with someone based on their sexual orientation. So privilege, this is an important piece of understanding these health disparities. I spent a lot of time in this presentation setting up the culture that contributes to health disparities in this community. So that's why I want to talk to you about what privilege is. It's a way of framing issues surrounding social inequality, focusing as much on the advantages that one group accrues from society as on the disadvantages that another group experiences. In this case, we're talking about privileges garnered because of one's heterosexuality or perceived heterosexuality. So what are all those things a heterosexual person can access that a homosexual person can't? What are all of those, kind of privileges in society that one who is in a same-sex relationship can just kind of really, in most cases, ignore? Because the privilege, when you have those privileges, you're less likely to pay attention because they're good things. When you're missing out on those privileges, the people who are missing out are usually paying a lot more attention because they have them. So, like, for example, holding the hand of your partner in the street, right? Over the, 20-some years since I came out, that's way more culturally and socially accepted than it used to be. It used to be, man, totally anxiety generating for me to have kind of like physical contact with someone I was dating in public. Like maybe in a dark movie theater, but definitely not at the park. Like no way. Why? Because I was afraid. Because the reality is, and it still is true, that you get beat up if you do that in public. Much less likely to happen now than it was 20 years ago, but Bravo, the Buckeye Regional Anti-Violence Organization, they serve the same-sex community around issues of violence. They just issued an alert. It was on Channel 10 last night. That there's been somebody who's been targeting the bars in the short north and putting drugs in people's drinks, and then people are lapsing in memory and waking up in places they how it got there. Anyway, so this stuff's still happening. But that's a good example of a privilege that happens for people who are in heterosexual relationships that doesn't in same-sex relationships. And there are privileges attached to gender expression as well, right? Like the privilege of being able to go to the bathroom without being harassed. Anyone ever been harassed on the way to the bathroom? It just sucks. You have been. Tell me why. Probably could guess.
Yeah, it's just a matter of challenges.
Yeah, like what is culturally identified as female, right? Your hair's not long enough, and suddenly you're a threat when you walk into the bathroom. I personally have found that it's less bad than it used to be, but my God, I used to be when I drove to Chicago a lot. Every time I had to go to the bathroom in Indiana, like anywhere on the roadside for us, it was just not good. I'm like, just don't drink anything on your drive to Chicago, so you don't have to pull it out. But the privilege of being able to walk into a bathroom and not having to think about it, that's not something that comes for many people who their gender expression doesn't follow a traditional path. Okay, so any questions or thoughts about any of this stuff? Okay. One of the handouts you picked up is called the Heterosexual Questionnaire. And I wanted to just take a couple of minutes for you guys to look at that. This is, and you don't have to write any answers down. We'll just take a couple of minutes to look at it. This is a questionnaire that was developed in 1972 by Martin Rothko. He was a pioneering gay-affirming psychologist. So in the 1970s, and prior to that, sexual orientation, if you were in the same-sex relationships, that was deemed a psychological disorder, right? And so if you went to a therapist around it, they were trying to convert you because you had a disorder. But Martin Rothko was going against that grain and saying, actually, sexual orientation along a variety of spectrums is perfectly normal. And here's a way that I want to let my clients know how thinking of sexual orientation difference as a disorder is harmful to them. So he came up with this questionnaire that kind of helps us demonstrate the notions of heterosexism. So just take a minute and take a look at that. Answer some questions if you want, and then we'll talk about it. I'll let you take this home tonight. You can quiz your friends and family. You call your parents and ask them some questions. But let's just talk about this. Like, what is your kind of immediate response to this questionnaire? And I'm curious, how many people have seen this? A couple people? Yeah. What is your kind of initial response to this, for those of you who haven't seen it? Anyone? There's got to be some feeling around it. Yeah. Tells you what privilege looks like. Yeah, the tricky thing about privilege is for those people that have it, it makes itself invisible. You don't have to think about it. So you really, when you ask people to look at their privilege, a lot of people have a really hard time with that because it's been invisible to them their whole lives and take it for granted. But this is a good tool for doing that. Any other thoughts anyone has or response to reading it? Yep.
Also, I've heard many questions reading down through it ask of people I know that identify as gay or others. So I think it's interesting to ask it, in this framework, because it does make you realize, like you said, the privilege, but also makes you question, like, why would we ever ask that of someone?
Yeah.
Like, why? I mean, because it seems really silly when I read down through it and they're asking it, of me, and I'm like, it's the same thing.
Just how it is, right? Like, how am I supposed to explain this?
No, it really puts it in perspective, though. I like this a lot.
Yeah. And it's this, like you said, it's the common battery of questions you get come out as some the same-sex relationship. Yeah.
There's a way that these questions in reading that they weren't really controversial, and that's that they would rile you.
Yeah.
But and maybe it's just kind of
Well, you wouldn't, I mean, so give me an example of one that you feel that way about in here.
So I thought the thing about the segregation of military housing, that kind of, yeah, that's actually true. That I thought about it, but you would ask that of somebody who was an FL green for the man, how can you live in America? I can imagine they would have been very offended by that type of question.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's turning all of that on right on its head. Any other thoughts? Comments? I think it's a really good tool, again, for drawing attention to how heterosexism plays out, and then the invisibility of privileges that come with it. These are things that people who are in same-sex relationships, either they're asked these questions directly, and if, it's one of those, kind of like pregnant women, people, when they find out that you are LGBT identified, lots of times they feel like that gives them license to ask whatever kind of question pops into it, right? Where, those questions you would never even think of asking someone who was heterosexual, because it would be kind of rude and invasive. But a same-sex person or someone in a same-sex relationship just like think, well, I get to ask them everything about all of the whatever goes on. But again, this is what happens, kind of a heterosexist way. Okay, and again, you can apply the same lens to gender identity and gender expression. So you could come up with a similar questionnaire around transgender identities, or questions that would be asked of a more masculine woman or more feminine male that would follow the same track. Does that make sense? Okay. So, cultural competence. Why do we talk about it? In the field that I'm in, and in growing kind of just service kind of fields, human relations type work, you hear a lot of people talk about this notion of cultural competence. And I used to work at the state health department, and every grant that we sent out to every health department, social service agency across the state of Ohio had a requirement that if you took money from the state health department, had to demonstrate that the work that you were doing was culturally competent. Now, how you demonstrated that, we weren't so good at examining. But we asked every person to show that they were doing something to be culturally competent, which tells me that there's a really strong push in the governmental level and a recognition that the lack of cultural competence causes a problem for people in terms of health. So that's what I'm getting at here. Cultural competence is a really powerful tool for tackling these larger issues of health inequity or health disparities. Okay, so to define health inequity, those are the differences in health which are unnecessary and avoidable, and additionally are considered unfair and unjust. Okay, so the notion of health equity and health inequity is very closely tied to questions of social justice. So it's not just that there are differences based upon identity or neighborhood or location, but that something about those differences are culturally produced and that they're not really very fair. So we talk about cultural competence, and I think it's important to actually not just fill out, check a box on a grant application, but actually demonstrate how you talk to people who work in health-related fields. Make sure they're trained in cultural competence, because having that competence helps you provide better health care for people and means people are healthier. So let's just talk about that. So first, to explain this concept of health inequity, the components of it, it's systematic. It means those inequities and consequences are not random, but follow a pattern. Okay, so a really good example of how of something that is not an accident, but it follows social policy in a pattern, is to think about school funding. Like, how do we fund our schools, and what neighborhoods you live in, and how does that play out in your ability to access education? Everybody has some feeling about this. How does funding work for schools in our society?
Testing.
Testing?
Yeah.
Okay, that's part of it. What else? Taxes. Taxes tied to what? Property. Property and property value, right? So we've set up a system in this country, and it varies depending on what jurisdiction you're in. Generally speaking, in the United States of America, the educational system is funded through property taxes. Your property taxes are determined by the value of your property. If your property is valued low and you're in a neighborhood where other properties are valued low, and usually, low value properties are in clumps together, and neighborhoods together, and high value properties are together, then you have more or less money to fund the educational system within your community. And then what happens in terms of the access to education that you get? How is that a predictor for a person over the course of their life? Just generally speaking. Yeah. Yeah, typically the better access, a better education you can access, the better outcomes you're going to have in your life. Better health outcomes, better social outcomes, better financial outcomes, right? But the system for funding education could be changed. We could do it a different way. We could do it the same way we fund the roads, just a flat tax. Right, and so, the roads out here in this neighborhood, and this is not a perfect example because a lot of times you do see a lot of potholes. But in theory, the way the taxes are collected around, whether you have a fire department or not, is different than the taxes that are collected around education. So we could change that system. But health inequities, so that's not a health. Concrete health example, but that gives you an idea of what a systematic kind of structure is that promotes inequity, right? And we've done all kinds of things to try to address that inequity, except change the tax structure. Like, we've come up with these things like vouchers to go to different neighborhoods, or busing, or testing scores, or charter schools, blah blah blah, hundreds of different ways. Okay, so we know that in our culture that there's some inequity around that. We've come up with social answers to it. Not the ones I the easiest, but in any case, that's not here to talk about. Those health inequities are socially produced. I guess I already talked about that. You can trace those back to the social determinants of health. So in health, we think about it's not, we're taking it way beyond just biology, all right? So what contributes to a person's health? There are social things that contribute to a person's health. There's the neighborhood, the education, social norms, access to care, food security, etc. A whole bunch of things contribute to a person's health outcomes. At the health department, we've done some geo mapping, right? And so we were looking at life expectancy by zip code. And there was a report that came out recently that looked at the life expectancy in Columbus if you lived in Franklinton neighborhood, or if you lived in Powell. And you guys are familiar with those neighborhoods? So Franklin's West Side, kind of historically Appalachian, lower socioeconomic status. Powell is a growing suburban community, lots of property, very expensive property, you know, the exurbs, right, way out on the Beltway. Anyone want to take a guess at what the life expectancy is in Powell versus Franklinton?
20 years.
20 years difference? What do you think? So 70-50, 60-80, what do you think? 75-55? 64 and 84. And that is just a flat, you know, evaluation. If you live in Franklinton, your life expectancy is 64, and that's, you know, held for all of the other factors. If you live in Powell, your life expectancy is 80. Okay, very good example of socially produced, like how the social determinants of health play out in terms of a person's experience of health course of lifetime. And then this piece here, which is what I love about working in public health, is that there's a recognition that this whole structure has an element of being unfair to it, all right? So that there really, if we were to take a more just look at how society is designed, we would see that there's an ethical and moral connotation to this work that we're doing. And like, could we think about how to design neighborhoods in a way that was a little more equitable? So for example, in Franklinton, how many grocery stores are you going to find in a 2-mile radius? How many hospitals? How many parks? How many safes, you know, how many streets, how many sidewalks that are paved versus if you go in Powell? I don't know. I feel like every time I'm out on the Beltway, there's another hospital being built or another urgent care. And in Franklinton, there's just, you've got Mount Carmel West, and that's really it. It's the only thing that's there. South side is the same is true of the south side of campus. That's even worse than the west because there's no hospital on the south side. So thinking about redistribution of resources in a way that's more fair, just. Yes?
One point I agree with all of them. Another point I look at is the political, those that are politically, a lot of decision making where budget dollars are allocated are often done by elected officials. And if they don't have a good understanding about what's happening in communities, and to see a lot of it, and to kind of hit home to me, I still have a place in Chicago, and all the crime that's there, particularly over on the south side, and what we don't see in terms of addressing mental health communities. And when you sort of follow that system down, you realize you start looking at the voting patterns that represent it can have a real effect on the health of the particular area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, when you look at, if you can track the, you know, Board of Elections can track which neighborhoods, who votes in which neighborhoods. And then you can see how much money comes into those neighborhoods and all of that. It's all tied together into this whole systematic institutional structure. The thing that's exciting working in public health is that there are ways to start chipping away at that. Not as quickly as I'd like, but, you know, through politics, through social policy, we can start to change some of those things. So health equity is the fairness and distribution of resources between groups with differing levels of social advantage, and kind of trying to get to an environment where everyone has equal access or equitable access to health. Everyone has a kind of similar chance to be healthy. So an important thing to note is equity does not mean equal. It's a different word. It has a different meaning. It doesn't mean everything has to be exactly the same in PAL as it is in framework. What it means, though, is that there is, better distribution of what's on the pie, right? Like making sure that there are places where you can buy fresh fruits and vegetables in every neighborhood, so that every kid has a chance to have fresh food and vegetables, and then therefore will have a less chance of becoming obese, and then less likely to develop diabetes and all of those things across. Making sure that everyone has access to health care. The Affordable Care Act is a perfect example of a policy that was driven by questions of health equity. How do we look at designing a public policy that makes it more fair, gives more of the population equal or equitable access to good health outcomes? Does that make sense? So that's what we're trying to do, is achieve health equity. So when we talk about cultural competence, what do we mean by that? And I think it's a term that, again, like when I was working at the health department and I would like send out all these grants, I just often scratched my head and wondered how many people who received those grants actually knew what cultural competence means. It's a real big buzzword, but I like to break it apart into its kind of components here. So when we're talking about culture, questions of culture, and culture refers to a person's language, thoughts, behaviors that are specific to your race, your class, your ethnicity, your religious affiliation, your sexual orientation, your geographic location, all of those things. So a person's cultural identity is made up of these different things. All right, so when we're talking about cultural competency, we're talking about all of these components of a person's identity. Those things make up their culture, right? So to think about like my personal individual culture, to like really, it's really easy to look at people and make a quick determination of what you think you might know about them. But if you don't have an open mind or some more information, you're not always going to get the whole story. Like, so for example, for me, I'm from Southern Ohio. My family on my dad's side, totally Appalachian, lived in the hills, very thick accent. My mom's side of the family, her mother grew up in California, the very like sort of California-esque form, 1950s. Dad grew up completely dirt poor. My mom grew up upper middle class. They got married, and then over the course of their lifetimes, my dad became a school teacher and had worked 4 jobs, joined the military, and was very successful. My mom, they split. My mom had some problems with addiction and alcohol abuse and mental health challenges, and died in a homeless shelter. And all those things contribute to my culture, right? So I identify as a white, lesbian, female, Appalachian, feel kind of comfortable in terms of class identity on the poverty spectrum, and now I'm living pretty middle class life, so I'm often conflicted between the like have money, don't think I'll ever have money, how do I handle money issues, because I've had my feet both worlds. Anyway, all those things, so those aren't immediately obvious to a person. Some markers of that, like I'm actually getting ready to go to Southern Ohio tonight. Tomorrow I might have some of my accent back. Or if I say certain words like windmill and I'm not trying really hard, it'll come out windmill. It just happens. And I didn't try to lose my accent, I just left young enough that most of it just fell away on its own. But you wouldn't get that like marker from me if I tell you that about it. But that, my God, that Appalachian kind of background, upbringing for me has a lot to do with, like, I was telling this example in another training. Has anyone ever done the Bridges Out of Poverty training? Some folks have. So one of the things they teach you, this cultural competence thing to know about people who live in impoverished situations, is that you're constantly living in this state of scarcity. And when that happens, you're constantly, like, if you have an opportunity of abundance, like that table over there, you're going to take 6 apples and 4 things of pretzels and whatever you can stuff in your pockets, because you don't know what you're going to have tomorrow. My dad grew up that way, and he's in his 70s, and he loves to talk about how he's saved $1 million. Okay, so he has money. if he was here at the end of this training, he would be the one taking all those pretzels and the apples, and I am that same way too. I'm like, I have to be careful, like don't take too many like pretzels, someone else might want them. But that is very much like the result of the culture that I grew up in, and it isn't nothing to really reflect the place I am in my life right now. But that's information that's good for you to have if you're serving people who are impoverished, is knowing about, instead of looking at someone being like, they're greedy, that's just greed. Well, actually, probably that has to do with experiencing scarcity and hunger. And I'm getting sidetracked, but that gives you an example of how culture plays out. Competence implies the ability to function within the context of diverse beliefs, behaviors, et cetera, of whatever population you're serving. So it doesn't mean that you know everything there is to know about whatever population that you're serving. Okay, it doesn't mean that I'm going to teach you 5 golden rules of how to serve the LGBTQ community, and then it'll be all easy from there. You'll know, and you'll be able to say I'm LGBTQ. And that doesn't hold true for any of these things that you can become culturally confident about. But it does mean that you are able to be flexible enough to recognize there are diverse beliefs and behaviors of the way diverse community that you serve when you're providing health services. So the City Health Department, I've only been there a year and a half, but what always impressed me about Columbus Public Health before I started 15 years ago, they had their signs translated into Somali because we started getting an influx of Somali immigrants in Columbus, Ohio after the wars in Somalia. And right away, the public health department started having signs that were and translators available to be able to talk to people and provide services, immunizations, whatever people might need, maternal health. And that's a really good example of what happens when you're ahead of the curve in terms of cultural, because the changing landscape of your community and you make sure that you adjust your services to accommodate those changes. So the real definition of cultural competency, like what you see typically used, is that it's a continuous learning process that builds knowledge, awareness, skills, and capacity to identify, understand, and respect the unique beliefs, values, customs, languages, abilities, and traditions of all people in order to provide effective programs and services. So that's a mouthful, but I think that all of those pieces are really important, right? So continuous learning process. This is why it's not like I just gave you your 5 things you need to know and now you're good to go. Because cultures change. I mean, that's the nature of culture. Think about, what culture was like for teenagers growing up in the 1950s versus what it is now, what it was 10 years ago, what it is now. My God, like before cell phones, and that wasn't even that long ago, people interacted as teenagers with each other in really different ways. Like the word sexting, we didn't even have it, That's how quickly culture changes. So to be culturally competent, you have to recognize this as a continuous learning project. And that in the process of trying to learn continuously, that plays into your ability to work with these diverse populations. So what does this community look like in Columbus? We do not have good data on the LGBT community really at all because we don't ask. We usually don't ask people their sexual orientation or their gender identity. We typically on intake forms for anything, whether that's signing up to vote or going to the doctor, you're asking the person's sex or gender, and those 2 words have been used interchangeably so much right now that it drives me crazy because I think it's got to the point where gender has just replaced sex as the identifier on those terms right now, and they're very different things. So we're having to do some work to try to combat that, but since we don't ask gender identity or sexual orientation, we don't have good statistics on how many people there are in this country that fit that category. The 2010 census did have some questions around sexual orientation, so you can see the government recognizing. I mean, and I was out of the country last week, but Obama said transgender in his State of the Union address, and that made the news. So that tells you that, like, at a governmental level, right, we're recognizing this is a population that exists and needs services. But like most things, you can't fund services if you can't demonstrate statistically that these needs exist. You can't demonstrate the needs exist if you can't demonstrate the people. But so the best estimates we have come from the Williams Institute that takes all kinds of different measures, puts them all together, and comes up with estimates of this population. So the estimate they came up with in 2006, and it's a pretty legitimate estimate. I guess there's a lot more, but anyway. I like to put that number in there because 68,000, that's a significant number, right, in a city this size. It's almost enough people to fill a shoe, right? I mean, we're not talking about just, that's a reference a lot of people, but we're not talking about just, 600 or 700 people, right? We're talking about 68,000 people. That's 3 times as many people that live in the city that I grew up in. So what if everyone there was LGBT? I mean, that just gives you kind of point of reference. Should tell you that this is a community that exists in significant populations, so you're going to encounter them for services, and when you're doing services. So that, again, that's extrapolated from the limited national data that exists. United Way in Columbus did a survey a few years ago that has very limited data, but the point being that we just really don't have good numbers. This gives you some idea of what we're talking about. So before I go into the specific health disparities experienced by this community, it's worth talking about what happens because this is so stigmatized. All right, so when you think about the stigma that people who are LGBTQ experience, and you think about that heterosexual questionnaire, what are some things that come up to you that, or just things that you're aware of, or individually you've experienced, or people, family, or you're close to have experienced? What are some of the stigmas that are attached to people in same-sex relationships or kind of more fluid gender identity? Think of any of the stigma associated with this. You can look back at your questionnaire because some of the answers are there, but yeah, go ahead. Okay.
Sharing their private life, overly sharing their private life,
Yeah.
if they're not,
Uh-huh.
like, oh, you have short hair, like, you don't need to be so out in the open about that.
Right. Yeah, so people are too forthcoming, maybe. Like, this is something that you shouldn't be forthcoming about because it's something to be ashamed of that you should hide. So there's a kind of this implicit message there that that's something that should be secret. What else?
Questionnaire religion.
Questions about religion, as if those things are associated with each other or determinants of one another. I tell you, King Avenue Church down there, right down the street, they would tell you that just walk in that place on a Sunday morning, blow any stereotype you have in your mind about religious faith. It's full of them every single weekend. And I think you'll see more and more churches that are open. That doesn't mean everybody is, and it's the same across the general population. Yeah, stereotypes about religion. What else? Or lack of, and lack of is a bad thing, maybe. Yeah, what else? Yeah. Sexual promiscuity. Yeah. STIs go along with that, right? Like, HIV, you're just going to get it, or other STIs. Let me tell you something that came up for me. So I've got my graduate degree here and in a very open field of women's studies. When I finished that degree, tried to get a job, and it's not a field for hiring men. But I ended up, my sexual orientation and feeling safe was really important. So I ended up working in a coffee shop teaching site, blah, blah, blah. So I had this series of jobs that were, my sexual orientation wasn't an issue. I didn't have to, I made sure I surrounded myself with safe people and unsafe environments. And I'm a swimmer, and there's a gay swim team in town. I was swimming on the gay team, and I love swimming, and I love kids. And the guy that coached us, he was coach of a team in New Albany here in Columbus, and he asked me to come coach. And I was like, that's awesome. I would love to coach swimming. I love kids. I love swimming. It's awesome. And then I started coaching, and I had to go out to coach, and I was like, what am I going to have to deal with because I have short hair, Maybe they'll read me as a list. Are there questions about leaving around for kids, blah, blah, blah. I didn't have to confront the reality of that really that much, but it was a fear that came up for me. So, that's kind of how that stigma played out. Anyway, all that stuff is very closely related to these social determinants of health. Okay, so the way the stigma plays out is really integrated into whether you can access something like marriage or visitation to your same-sex partner hospital, all that stuff. So thinking about how stigma plays in. And then I think in this field, you hear more and more people talking about microaggressions and the impact of microaggressions. So just in case you've heard that microaggressions really refers to all the little tiny ways that people who are different in whatever way starts to pile up on them and contribute to poor outcomes in whatever way. Okay, so that's a term that you'll hear used. Okay, so just thinking about what the impact is of stigma on people's health outcomes. Some of that will be clear when we look at what these actual health disparities are that are experienced by us community. So higher rates of suicide, higher rates of homelessness, higher rates of breast and cervical cancer, increased rates of HIV and obesity, higher rates of alcoholism and tobacco use, more instances of mental health challenges, and then of all these disparities, they're higher for people who are trans. So again, when you think about stigma, how does stigma play into these health disparities? Yeah.
Seems to like how different rates of this are heterosexual.
Yeah, so I don't have concrete numbers in front of me. I can tell you a place to look for that is Healthy People 2020. Look at Healthy People 2020 to get all those exact numbers. But I can tell you the rate of homelessness, that the vast majority of homeless youth are LGBT identified, all right? And if you think about the impact of stigma, why might that be? Kicked out of their house, yeah, kicked out of their house because of their sexual orientation, gender identity. Lose their home, end up out on the street. Most of the homeless shelters aren't equipped to accommodate either youth or LGBT youth. They're not, especially trans youth. They don't. Everything's divided by male and female. We've been working with Faith Mission, the local homeless shelter, and with the Star House that's operated here through OSU to try to find ways to make them more culturally competent, and they're trying, but it's not easy, right? Everything has to be divided male and female. Let's see if I know.
I know one.
Yeah, go ahead.
Both rates double among gay men.
Yeah,
40%.
yeah. And what do you? How do they explain that?
I've done some literature, looked at some literature, and I don't think that it's any different than anybody else. They are help,
Right.
Help.
Yeah.
And we also are now to help
Right.
these people. There's an article about these people. And it makes sense to go up and smoke breaks together and eat like we eat. So we tend to hang. There's some of that kind of. It's most highly correlated with depression and these social things.
Yeah, and if you think about where LGBT people historically have socialized, it's been in bars. There's been a lot, the laws have changed now, but a lot of historically at least drinking and smoking in bars, which contribute to those higher rates of alcohol. I wish I had those stats in front of me. I can get them and send to you, but they're dramatically different, particularly for the trans-identified people. The rates of suicide. I feel like I read something that in Ohio, the trans community, 60% of them had attempted suicide at some point. Very, very high. Yes.
Interestingly enough, I also analyzed the Australian study of health, and they're looking at all of these things, women who identify as exclusively heterosexual and exclusively lesbian, much the same, and
has to do with social acceptance of birthing, like you're mentioning. So, these are the things. Again, the reference is on your slide there. Look at Healthy People 2020, those exact statistics. And there's a lot of new studies that have been coming out from like the Drug and Alcohol Board, and because people are paying more attention to this population. Okay, so I just want to share with you a case study. We're doing okay. So example of across a 20-year period of culturally incompetent competent care. So this is kind of like, these are some examples of things I experienced. I moved to Columbus after college because I knew there was a gay community here. I was still trying to figure things out for myself. So this is where I lived. Nothing to do with the job. I didn't have a job, and I just felt like I needed to get that part of my life sorted out before I figured everything else out. So in 1994, when I was 24, I went to Planned Parenthood to get my annual exam, and I was, aware enough that that was something I needed to do. I wasn't in heterosexual relationships, but many lesbians don't take care of their annual pap smears because of the misperception that if they're not engaged in intercourse with a man, they have a risk for cervical cancer, or they don't have. So that has something to do with the increased rate of cervical cancer. In any case, I went to Planned Parenthood to get that taken care of, filled out my intake forms. The nurse that was checking me through started asking me questions from my forms. And one of the things they asked me was I sexually active? And they asked me if I was using birth control. And they asked me all those serious questions. And so he started reading my forms. And he looked at me and he said, "Are you trying to get pregnant?" And, what had happened for him was that he read that I was sexually active. And then he read that I wasn't using birth control. And the only place that he could go in his mind with that was to the place that I was had engaged in a kind of sexual activity that could result in being pregnant, which wasn't at all true for me. I didn't need to use birth control because there was absolutely no chance in the world I was going to end up pregnant with the kind of sex I was having. But the forms were not designed in such a way to allow for that kind of identity, nor was he, as a clinician, at least with me, maybe on that day, I don't know, but he was not in the place where he knew what to do with those questions and answers. And, that left me feeling just not good, right? Like, I also didn't have a place on that form to identify as a lesbian. They didn't ask my sexual orientation. So I either had to decide in that moment, I'm going to come out to you and tell you what's going on, or I'm going to shield some of my health information with you. Either way, this is not going well, right? Because all of the information is now on the table. I've now been made to feel sort of visible, and it's not a good healthcare experience. Now, I don't want to, decry Planned Parenthood because that was a long time ago. Things have probably changed, but it was a early kind of healthcare experience that stayed with me as I was coming into my own, young adult. 10 years later, by that time, and I went through years of insurance, no insurance, blah, blah, blah. But I had established myself finally with a family health practitioner, and I was approaching 35 years old, and I was in a committed relationship with my partner, and we were, knew we wanted to have children, and starting to talk about that. And it occurred to me at that time that when you're 34 and you want to have kids, by that time your life 35 is considered maternal age, and that your chances of getting pregnant start to diminish. So I knew that I was coming up on that, and then all of a sudden it occurred to me I had been seeing my family practitioner and getting my pap smears and my breast exam and all that stuff with her for the last 8 years, and she never once asked me about my fertility. And then it made me wonder, well, why didn't she? Did she not ask me? I thought she was a lesbian, but we didn't even come out to each other, and there was no place for me to come out, and I never came out to her. And so I wondered, did she not ask me because she assumed I was a lesbian and then therefore assumed I wouldn't ever want to get pregnant or have children, or what? Why wasn't that part of the conversation? Maybe it was because primary care physicians just aren't asking fertility-based questions, but for me as a patient, because I am in a same-sex relationship, because I'm a masculinely identified, it took me down this place of questioning, would my care have been different had I had a different gender identity, or or, different expression around my sexual orientation, or was talking about my boyfriend at home, or, like those conversations didn't come up. Maybe sometimes they do with physicians. And some of that has to do with just not being sure that you're in a comfortable space and worrying about the ramifications if you test that, right? So something else that then later became a bigger issue for me when I did try to get pregnant, and it didn't work out. And so again, that got me thinking more about, like, how would my healthcare have been different if I had been with a physician who had been talking about social questions, asking me at some point, hey, you're 30, you're 31, do you want to have kids? Because if you do, you better put a move on it or get some tests done or something, but that never happened. So then 10 years later, or 8 years later, whatever it is, my partner got pregnant and had our first son. And she did a home birth. And so when you do a home birth, we had a midwife, and you have your birth certificate process is a little bit different because you're not in hospital setting. And so you have to get someone to witness the birth of the child. And the midwives can't do it because we have very antiquated laws around midwifery in Ohio. So they don't want to put their name on anything for legal reasons. So that meant I got to put my name on the birth certificate. Well, the only reason that's significant is because I'm in a same-sex relationship, and in Ohio, the birth certificates have a space for a mother and father. They don't have space for parent one or parent two. And so because I'm in a same-sex relationship, there was no way I was going to be able to get on that birth certificate, except that we had a home birth. And so I had the opportunity to list myself as a witness and sign that I witnessed the birth of the child. So I did. And then they give you on that form a couple of different options to identify yourself as. And one is witness, one is physician, I don't know what it was. And so me and my partner, being the kind of people who like to push the envelope, we just signed my name, comma, mother. And went down to the health department. I wasn't working there at the time, and I'm like, this is going to be an issue, right? It's not legal, but I'm going to try it anyway. And so I gave the woman my form, and she looked at it, and then she looked at me, and she was like, okay, well, I'm going to submit this to the state vital statistics office. I've never seen this before, and we'll see what happens. And she did, and we went back and forth for about a month, and finally the state accepted the language of guardian on that certificate form. But the real thing about that experience that I like to share with people is that her response was the best it could have possibly. She couldn't give me what I wanted. I knew she couldn't give me what I wanted. The laws won't allow that, right? That's an institutional thing that's been designed to keep me from having a legal relationship with the child I'm rearing. But she didn't laugh at me. She didn't tell me I was crazy. She pushed the envelope for me, and it just made me feel better, and that's a really good example of, I think sometimes you can't give someone what they want, but if you just hear them and acknowledge them, it makes all the difference. Because we can't always give people what they want, right? Sometimes it's just not possible. Then the last thing I wanted to talk about was a couple years later, my partner was pregnant with our other child, and she found out she had a melanoma. Needed to get surgery. So she had the surgery very soon after our daughter was born. So our daughter's 2 years old, or two weeks old. We go down to the James Hospital, and we went through the intake process, and front desk staff, everyone, all the forms, they were really great. There was a space for her to write next of kin, partner. The forms were really culturally competent. The people that checked us in said hi to me, and I felt very comfortable. And then we went back to the operating room, waiting for them to come back. The nurses were coming around checking us in, and in operating rooms there's a privacy, so you can hear what's being said all around you. So the standard question that the nurses were asking of all the patients when they saw the patient sitting with someone was, "Who did you bring with you today?" And then when he came to me, he looked at me and looked at my partner and then said to her, "Is that your mom you brought with you today?" So, yeah, that's not good for a couple of reasons, right? We're only 5 years apart, but I'm also co-demanding the baby, right? And I'm the baby's mother, and my partner is my partner, and we're, you know what I mean? And I was immediately invisible, and I just felt awful. And then they took her to the operating room, and I went to the waiting room, and I was just like, God, that felt horrible. I'm like posting on Facebook, here's what happened, you know, because you do that because you get immediate support, right? And then I thought, I'm gonna have to say something. This is work I do in my life. And he came out a little while later to tell me everything was okay, and I was like, you know that thing back in the operating room, you asked me that question, and he knew what had happened. He saw my face, right, and knew, and all of that. He said, yeah, I'm really sorry. And I said, well, you know, it really hurt a lot. It made me feel really invisible. This is obviously a really moment right now. Like, brand new baby, my partner's having a really serious surgery, and I just got made invisible. He said, I'm really sorry. I will never make that mistake again. And I'm sure he never will. And a couple of things that happened from that is I know he will never make that mistake again. It also made me feel better to say something and for both of us to get that human experience going there and not just be like, oh, that guy. But that, I think, is a really good example of how you get this combination of things being right suddenly go wrong. Like the training at the James they're doing something right there because everything all the way through until we got to that moment was right on target. And if he had asked me the question the way he and the other nurses asked all of their other patients that question, I would have said, or my partner would have said, I brought my partner with me. That's who's sitting there in that chair. You could have said, I brought my neighbor, I brought my daughter, I brought my best friend, whoever. You know, this is how life is, right? We're not in nuclear worlds anymore. We bring whoever we can take with us who cares for us to the hospital. And their training was such that that's the typical question. I mean, I think he just didn't know what to do. And that happens frequently. You know, people just don't know what to do with two women together and a little baby, and especially if one of them has gray hair, because then it's all like grandma path. But I think that's a really good example of just how something as simple as language choice really makes it care. And I wasn't even the person to care for it, but it was my experience with a healthcare environment. So what do you do to provide culturally competent care? And you know, this is why we're here, so I can teach you some of that. Recognize your own bias. Everybody's got it. We grow up in cultures and society that tell us bias. Bias isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes it's useful. Sometimes it's horrendous. But we all have it. But be aware of what your biases are, and keep them in check. If they're a bias that would lead you down towards a path of, you know, unfriendly behavior. Refrain from making assumptions. Right? Those assumptions can be really painful. Don't assume that two women walking in together are sisters. You don't have to assume they're a couple either. Ask a question in a way that's culturally competent, that's open-ended, that allows people to self-identify. Create your forms in such a way that allow people to identify in a variety of ways. You know, parent one, parent two. You know, guardian, or, you know, because not everybody has two parents, right? Not everybody has heterosexual parents. That's where the use inclusive language comes in. Do things in a way that allows for a range of possibilities. Make sure you're asking sex, gender identity, sexual orientation questions, so you give people the space to know what your community resources are. If you're, you know, let's say you're a nurse working in an emergency room and you see a patient come in and they've had a domestic violence attack, right? Like, make sure you find out if that person's in a same-sex relationship or not, or heterosexual, because the place you send them for services is going to be different. You want to know that, and I've got a resource form there for you to know the community resources and forms. Identify yourself as an ally, and I ran out of those cards, but those tribe cards, that's what we use at the health department. We've given those out to everyone and asked if they are an ally, because not everybody is, but to put those prominently so that not only patients can see them, but also that other staff can see them. Because you're not only serving people, but you're also working people who are LGBT. So make sure they can find you, right? Because it isn't an obvious identity in the way that. So like I have mine on my badge, and I have outside my door of my office. But that rainbow, anything rainbow, people who are under the rainbow know what that means. So use it. That's a way to identify yourself as an ally. Okay. And then what happens when you provide culturally competent care? You start to close those health disparities, which moves you towards achieving health equity. You improve health outcomes along the way. You increase community trust of healthcare establishments. So in this community, the places that are safe spaces for people to go, people share that information with each other. One of the things our health initiative is working on is creating a more concrete kind of resource guide of individual positions and settings that are culturally competent, because we don't have a good version of that now, but people talk to each other. So, we work with an organization in Ohio called Trans Ohio, and one of their executive director came to one of our events and told the story of one of his friends who was born female and is now fully living as male, but he didn't. He had a top surgery, so he had his breasts removed, and he takes testosterone, but he didn't have anything. And most people who are born female and are living as male don't make any changes to their bottom half, and so he still had all of the, ovaries, uterus, fallopian, all that stuff, right? And so being on the testosterone stopped him from having periods, but something went wrong and he started menstruating again, which was a horrendous experience for him. Turned out he had to have an emergency hysterectomy. He didn't have health insurance, so he went to a Minute clinic at a Kroger, and they turned him away. We can't do anything. What do you mean bleeding in down there? Like, you're a male. That can't possibly. And he got into a really tricky situation where they turned him away. Then he felt like he didn't have anywhere to go, so the bleeding got worse. He got to a really dangerous situation and finally ended up at ER, but they did treat him. But, those kinds of things, like, those keep people from having good outcomes. But if the converse had been true, if he had a good experience, he could have gone back to his friends and said, yeah, make sure you go to this place. That's what we do. And as we provide more culturally competent care, we decrease the ability of stigma to function as a barrier to care. So we start to move that way and give less power. We'll help better health outcomes. So I'm happy to take any questions you have. That's my little boy who's now 4, so that's an old picture, but I put that up there because that's why I do this work. Have some evaluations for you. You have this information on my slide. You can get a hold of me or Dwayne Stewart anytime at this number. And then I didn't have enough of these flyers, but this is something we made, an infographic to show the work that we're doing at the health department. This little brochure explains what the initiative is all about. We've done a lot of work in the last year and a half, and we want to keep doing that work, and I'm happy that you guys invited me here today.
Please raise your hand if you need a pen.
We're also, just 2 other quick announcements. We're doing an enrollment fair tomorrow at the health department. So for people who are LGBTQ or allies and need to get enrolled in the Affordable Care Act, we're doing an event where they can enroll at the health department. We do community conversations where we invite people in who fall under this rainbow to talk about their health care, and we're doing a community conversation about health care for LGBTQ people of color. So if you want those flyers, see me afterwards. I'd be happy to answer any questions. Right, the other thing, we typically provide continuing education credits for this presentation and how to mix up and are unable to do that today. So for anyone that came hoping to get CE credit, I am very sorry. I don't have it today. I'm doing this training again soon. If you want to come sit in again and type on your computer, I can get you credit that way. But I'm sorry that I'm unable to get it for you today.
Well,
Anyone have any questions? Thanks.